Hi, Mark Jones here with another international edition of Crime Chronicles, coming to you this time from the beautiful city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. In this edition, we take a look at the 1983 kidnapping of one of the Netherlands' most famous citizens, Alfred Heineken. Born in Amsterdam in 1923, Alfred, or Freddy Heineken, was the grandson of Gerard Heineken, the founder of Heineken International Brewery. Though Gerard was its founder, it was Freddy that made Heineken an international household name and put Dutch beer on the world map. Freddy Heineken assumed control of Heineken Breweries in 1971, and by the early 1980s, he was not only one of the richest men in Europe, but he was also an international celebrity, probably the most famous Dutch businessman in the world. Unfortunately, Heineken's enormous wealth and high profile put a target on his back. These 5 kidnappers had done their homework, and not just in terms of preparation, weapons acquisition, things of that nature. They had studied other famous kidnappings, including that of Charles Lindbergh's baby back in 1932. The most famous kidnapping of the 20th century in the United States took place in New Jersey in 1932, when Charles Lindbergh Jr., the infant son of the famous aviator, was kidnapped from his home and murdered. A German immigrant named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed for the Lindbergh kidnapping and murder. The 1970s and 1980s featured several famous kidnappings in Europe and the United States. Some were politically motivated, some were financially motivated, and some were a combination of both. Famous kidnappings from the 1970s and 1980s include the 1973 kidnapping in Italy of J. Paul Getty III, the son of the American oil billionaire. The 1974 kidnapping of American newspaper heiress Patricia Hearst in California. The 1975 kidnapping in New York of Samuel Bronfman II, heir to the Seagram's fortune. The 1978 kidnapping and murder of former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro at the hands of the Italian Red Brigades. And the 1981 kidnapping in Italy of American General James Dozier, also by the Italian Red Brigades. Alfred Heineken joined that list of famous kidnapping victims on November 9, 1983. Freddy Heineken and his chauffeur Abdorderer were kidnapped by 5 masked men and taken to a secure location, and there they would stay for the next 3 weeks. Some European kidnappings during the 1970s and 1980s, including that of J. Paul Getty III, were motivated by money. With others like General James Dozier and Prime Minister Moro, the motive was political. One of the radical groups of that era in Europe was the German Red Army, or the Baader-Meinhof gang, who operated in several countries, including West Germany and the Netherlands. The men who kidnapped Freddy Heineken wanted him to believe they were associated with the German Red Army, rather than just being common criminals. They agreed to speak German during the kidnapping, so that Heineken and Abdorderer would suspect that their kidnappers were German Red Army terrorists, hoping that would throw investigators off the trail. But some of the kidnappers inadvertently spoke Dutch during the abductions. So who were the kidnappers? One of the ringleaders was William Hollander. Hollander was a 25-year-old former outlaw biker nicknamed De Neus because of his large nose. The other ringleader was Hollander's childhood friend and brother-in-law, 24-year-old Cor van Hout, or Van Hout. They were joined by Jan Bulliard, Frans Meyer, and Martin Urkamps. Freddy Heineken had no idea that this kidnapping had been months in preparation. 5 men who pulled this off had been watching him for months, watching his every move. And it turns out, although he did not know it at the time, he had a tie to at least one of the kidnappers. Actually, the kidnappers had been planning their crime for 2 years. They had planned to kidnap Freddy Heineken at his home in Noordwijk in the southern part of the Netherlands, but the plans failed when Heineken failed to show as they had planned. So they decided to carry out the kidnapping in Amsterdam, the northern part of the Netherlands. Freddy Heineken, who had employed thousands of people, had no idea that Willem Hollander's father, Wim, had once worked for him, but had lost his job due to alcoholism. So, while Willem Hollander's primary motive was financial, he also bore a personal grudge against Freddy Heineken, a man who symbolized everything he hated and could never be: wealthy, respected, and known the world over. The elder Hollander was unaware of his son's crime.
Another participant in this kidnapping was a man named Cor van Hout, who was William Hollander's brother-in-law, as well as a childhood friend. The kidnappers took great pains to make it appear as if this operation were carried out by someone who was big time, like the Red Brigades. They thought if they used simple weapons, simple techniques, that police would figure right away it was more than noble than local criminals who pulled this off, which would put them on the trail of people like themselves. So part of the planning process here was to amass a huge number of weapons, to have a safe house constructed for the holding of the hostages, and that involved getting money. Now, for men who had lived on the margins of society and never been particularly successful in employment, how are they going to get money? The answer: bank robbery.
The kidnappers did not want to commit their crime on the cheap, as doing so would not only endanger its success, but would also make it appear that the kidnappers were small-town locals rather than infamous international criminals. To get the funds they needed, namely guns, disguises, or a proper getaway vehicle, and a place to hide their captives, the kidnappers pulled off a series of robberies, some involving high-speed boat chases through Amsterdam's canals.
The 5 kidnappers pulled off several robberies, several heists, in order to gain enough funds to do what they needed to do, and they toasted their plan to do this at a New Year's Eve party for a plan that would not be carried out until about 11 months later.
Freddy Heineken and his chauffeur Ab Doderer were kidnapped on November 9, 1983 at 6:56 p.m. in front of Heineken's office in Amsterdam. They were taken to a Quonset hut at a business park in Westport in the Amsterdam harbor area. The hut was prepared in advance by the creation of a double wall on one end with 2 soundproof cells with a hidden door. This made the 42-meter-long hut shorter on the inside by 4 meters, which went unnoticed. Outside their working hours, the kidnappers worked in shifts to provide for their prisoners, who were tethered to the wall with chains.
Well, after the 2 men were kidnapped, the kidnappers had to make it appear as if their life was going on as normal. So while someone was assigned to guard the hostages at all times, the 5 men went about their daily businesses and their jobs, so that they had, as to appear normal.
Not wanting to give away their Dutch nationality or have Heineken or Doderer be able to recognize their voices, the 5 kidnappers never spoke to their captives, but provided food and necessities for them in their huts. The 2 victims communicated with each other occasionally.
After the shock of being kidnapped wore off, Freddy Heineken was rather philosophical about the whole ordeal. He figured it was just a very unpleasant business transaction. His kidnappers would demand a ransom, the ransom would be paid, and the ordeal would be over. To some extent, he was right, and for the most part, he was stoic throughout his kidnapping experience. Now, Freddy Heineken made requests for special types of food, special types of drinks. Of course, those requests were not granted. But he said he always kept a piece of bread in his cell at night, in case the kidnappers did not come by with food the next day. The kidnappers actually admired Freddy Heineken's courage throughout his ordeal. They said later on they felt bad for Ab Doderer. Ab Doderer was not taking well to the situation, to say the least. And they regretted, believe it or not, the impact that it had on him.
While Freddy Heineken realized his situation sometimes came with wealth and fame, Ab Doderer was neither rich nor famous, and his ordeal was more traumatic for him than it was for Freddy Heineken. Heineken was sorry that Doderer was put through his ordeal because of Doderer's attachment to him.
Well, how much money did the kidnappers want? The answer, around $11 million in 4 different European currencies.
Law enforcement officials were wary of paying the ransom and advised against it, as they thought it would encourage similar crimes, and kidnapping had been a serious problem in Europe for over a decade. But they gave in to the wishes of the Heineken family.
The kidnappers were clever. They established contact with law enforcement and the Heineken family, but not directly, but in newspaper ads, using code language. The kidnappers had planned for this ordeal to last 48 hours, but as with the best laid plans of mice and men, it didn't go that smoothly. Other events kept getting in the way of this heist being pulled off and being completed successfully.
The ordeal winded up lasting 3 weeks.
The ransom money was paid as per kidnappers' instructions. Over $2 million, or the equivalent, was taken by the kidnappers to some woods and buried in the grounds. At that point, the kidnappers made their escape from that scene in the prototypical Dutch way. on bicycles. What went wrong? How did the kidnappers get caught? Police officers received an anonymous tip, which remains anonymous to this day, of who the kidnappers might be. And they start to surveil these 5 guys, at one point observing them ordering food from a Chinese restaurant.
Police officers were able to find Heineken and Doderer without assistance from the kidnappers. The kidnappers scattered, and Heineken and Doderer were freed on November 30th, 21 days after they were kidnapped.
Jan Billiard was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his participation in the kidnapping. He was released and re-imprisoned again for the murder of a Dutch customs agent. Frans Meyer turned himself into police and feigned mental illness. He also claimed he burned his share of the ransom money on a beach. After feigning mental illness, he escaped from a medical facility, fled to Paraguay, where he spent some time, and was eventually extradited back to the Netherlands and served his prison sentence. After Meyer was released from prison, he was re-imprisoned again, this time shot by police during a robbery, and re-imprisoned. Martin Urkamp was only 21 years old at the time of the kidnapping. He was sentenced to prison as well, was released, and was arrested in Spain several years later and re-imprisoned for a drug offense.
But the 2 men who became famous were Cor van Hout and William Hollander. The Heineken kidnapping gave them something they had always craved: notoriety.
The 2 principal figures here in this kidnapping, first was Cor van Hout. Van Hout, along with William Hollander, fled to France, where he was arrested and eventually extradited to the Netherlands. William Hollander and Cor van Hout became celebrities of a sort because of this kidnapping. They appeared on talk shows, on television, talking about the kidnapping, talking about their lives, when in fact the 2 men were perhaps among the 2 kingpins of Dutch organized crime in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And to show there's no honor or loyalty among thieves, Cor van Hout met his death at the hands of his childhood friend and brother-in-law, William Hollander. It wasn't until around 2019 that William Hollander was finally charged and convicted with the killing of his childhood friend and brother-in-law, and sentenced to prison, where he remains to this day. The approximately $11 million ransom paid for Freddy Heineken's release was the largest sum paid for a kidnapping in European history.
Alfred Heineken passed away in 2002. The kidnapping has been the subject of several books and 2 films, one of which, a Dutch language film, was released in 2011 with Rutger Hauer portraying Heineken. In 2015, a film called Kidnapping Mr. Heineken was released with Anthony Hopkins in the title role. A tragic footnote: Peter de Vries, who wrote 2 books about the Heineken kidnapping, was the Netherlands' leading investigative reporter on crime stories. In fact, it was de Vries who alerted authorities that Frans Meyer was hiding in Paraguay. Not only did he write the most well-known books about the Heineken case, he also covered the disappearance of Natalie Holloway, an American college student who disappeared in Aruba, part of the Dutch Commonwealth, in 2005. De Vries had several volatile exchanges with Joran van der Sloot, a Dutch man suspected but never convicted of Holloway's murder. Peter de Vries was shot and killed in 2021, allegedly by allies of a Dutch drug kingpin.
Before he died in 2002, Freddy Heineken lived long enough to see his kidnappers brought to justice. But his life was forever altered. He increased his security, and he took precautions everywhere he went. He joked to a friend that a guy like me can fly to the Caribbean or anywhere in the world on a minute's notice on his own jet, but he can't go to a theater in his hometown. Well, that about wraps this case up. I think it only proper that we take a toast to the memory of the man who made this possible and who made this name famous the world over, to the memory of Freddy Heineken and Heineken beer. Prost. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.